to our first webinar of the year. Thank you for joining us today. The topic is the future of data center electrical grid impacts, but really it's our analysis of data center market drivers, market outlooks. What do we think load's going to look like? How flexible is that load? And what sort of project sizes do we think we can expect in Australia? My name is Ezra Beeman. I'm managing director of Energea, and I'll be your host for today. I'm joined by my associate Sarah Gonzalez, who will be helping me on this webinar, and she'll be in charge of managing the Q&A session at the end of it, as well as any sort of uh, support along the way. So I'm going to move to our first slide. So as I said, today we're going to cover the drivers of data center growth, what loads efficiency and flexibility might look like, siting and sizing, and then we'll conclude with a summary of the key industry levers that we have to try and facilitate integration at least cost, and then a summary of key takeaways and recommendations. This webinar is being recorded, and you are welcome to forward on to anybody you think might be interested when it's issued either later today or tomorrow. And again, Sarah will be supporting me on the Q&A. Please feel free to drop in any questions you have along the way, and then there'll be a Q&A session at the very end. The other item to bring to your attention is that we like to hear from the audience in terms of what topics you think will be most exciting. I think data centers will have topped most people's list, and certainly those attending today. It's a very exciting topic for the industry. Yep, we already covered this. Right. So, with respect to the drivers of data center growth, now, if I could just take a moment and explain that most of this material is an outcome of some work that we did in California, which we've presented to a number of muni utilities here, some of which have some of the highest data center load as a share of their total load. Upwards of 50% of their load for some of these munis is already data centers. They do happen to serve Silicon Valley or its surrounds, but even so. And so it's been very interesting to get their feedback on the work, and also work regarding how this load might be become more flexible and more energy efficient over the coming years. Now, we think that while the drivers in Australia are very different in many respects, that there's a lot to be learned from the U.S. experience, and that's why we're bringing it here today. So let's start with some definitions and some data sources. We're covering data centers in general, but these data centers are driven by specific areas of the economy, from generative AI like ChatGPT, through social media like Facebook, or online e-commerce like Amazon. And you can actually relate that to different national accounts. Here, we've called out the NAICS codes, which is what it's called in North America. ANZIT codes is what we use in Australia to analyze this data. And when trying to understand what the forecast demand is for data centers, you can see here that you've got an industry name on the left, and then some of the sub accounts that are included in that name. And it's through this methodology that we've developed our own bottom up modeling of data center outlook or demand, um, that we'll be touching on today. So, what are the key questions? What drives electricity consumption in this sector? How flexible is that consumption, and how close to users does it need to be? How much do you need to compete for this load, and how much of that load really needs to be in your network area for various reasons? So we're going to do a couple of case studies here. The first is e-commerce. Now, one of the biggest challenges as a forecaster to work out is where in the S curve are we, and sort of how far out is the S curve. And anybody who's done any S curve modeling knows that to parameterize an S curve, you really just need to have a fixed endpoint, like 80% in 2050. But when you're dealing with something like um, the IT industries and IT sectors, or something like generative AI, which we've never had before, it can be quite a challenging problem to figure out, or even have initially develop your forecast or estimate of what we think saturation or penetration will be like at a certain point of time. So as forecasters, what we try to do is to understand what are the fundamentals of this particular segment, and how would those fundamentals be modeled, and therefore provide a forecast into the future. So in the case of e-commerce, we in this case looked at, well, what is U.S. GDP as a relative measure, and see what that sort of looks like over time, and then see what the e-commerce revenue is in comparison to it, to see if it's growing faster or slower than the rest of the economy. And you can see here that the e-commerce number, at least in the U.S., started to pick up quite considerably from about 2010, and is now rising much more rapidly than the economy itself. Now, in terms of how far it could continue to rise, how much of a hockey stick, so to speak, is there? Is it going to start asymptoting in 5 years, 20 years? We looked at, well, what is the current level of e-commerce sales relative to retail sales as well as wholesale sales? Because you can use e-commerce in both of these applications. And what we found was that it is still a tiny fraction of all retail sales, and also a tiny fraction of wholesale sales. If you add them together, it's still a tiny fraction. So, if in the future everything's going to be online, or almost everything, we'll probably still go to malls because we like trying things on in person. But who knows with virtual reality, that there is still a great deal of distance that e-commerce could grow before it's taking on all of the revenue. So then we looked at cryptocurrency mining, right? So this is a very different beast, where the actual deployment of servers is a function of what the current Bitcoin price is, and what is the cost of actually generating more Bitcoins. And so again, we looked at, well, what's historical GDP, and how fast has crypto been growing? You can see that from about 2015, it started to grow much faster than the GDP in the top left chart. On bottom left, we did some rudimentary math around how much it costs to actually do the Bitcoin mining. And I'm using Bitcoin here, and that's the data set we're using, but it could be Ethereum, it could be any of them. Um, but basically, to estimate, how many kilowatt hours does it take to create a certain number of hashes, and that gives us a certain cost per kilowatt hours, especially when you put a cost per kilowatt hour. And you can see that the rate of Bitcoin hashing uh, somewhat followed the annual price here. So it suggests that there is a relationship. As prices go up, you would expect more investment in Bitcoin mining, and on the opposite side, as prices go down, you'd expect demand to fall. Now we have a lot of experience with mining in Australia. And we would expect Bitcoin mining to operate much like regular mines, in that when the price goes below a certain level, everything shuts up shop, and there is no more demand from that sector. And so this, we would think, is a very price sensitive sector, as opposed to some of the other sectors we'll get onto in a little while. Now, what's interesting in the bottom right uh, graphic is that the Bitcoin mining areas aren't necessarily in the cheapest parts of the United States, or even where the cheapest energy prices are. Although Southeast and Texas has some of the cheapest in the country. So there are certainly other drivers at play here, in terms of where the Bitcoin mining will situate itself, and we'll get back to that in a couple of slides. So then let's talk about generative AI, the newest, I guess, segment of IT that has really only come on the scene in the last few years for most of us. And you can see from even 2020, it has been rising much faster than GDP. In terms of how much energy it uses to operate, we've got a comparison here in the bottom right chart that shows how much it takes in watt hours per request, and then compares that to chat gpt, and then to an AI powered Google request. And you can see that we're talking an order of magnitude or more between plain old Google search and an AI powered Google search. And that is indicative of the power requirements at the moment. Now, whether these power requirements are going to be sustained or if they can be more energy efficient, we turn to the bottom left chart. And here you can see how much it's taken to train these models. So on the right side, it's actually operated the model once trained. On the left side, it's how much it took to train them. And you see it's gone up and up and up. Now, the recently released Chinese version, which I always want to call deep fake, but is really called deep search, I think, um, is reportedly much lower in its energy requirements and its overall cost to build. But I still think there is more water to go under that bridge until we really have a solid understanding of what all was involved. Um, so stay tuned there. But the point of this graphic is there is a fair amount more energy required in terms of how much more AI we need. No one really knows at this stage. Is it going to be one AI thread per person? Is it going to be per person plus each device? This remains to be seen, and it's in this area that's most unknown. I think that the total demand is still coming into view, which may be why if you look across a number of relatively recent forecasts, you can see a divergence of opinion as to what U.S. Energy consumption will be from data centers. And these are all pretty well respected forecasts. It reminds me, if you look at historical forecasts of EV adoption in Australia, or even PV adoption, it doesn't look too dissimilar from this. And over time, the forecasts have gotten a lot more aligned to the point now that solar and EVs, plus or minus, is actually very tightly bound. But we're right now in the very early stages of this. All right, let's turn to okay. Well, so that's maybe how much consumption and how many sites, et cetera. But what is the basis of that consumption on a bottom up basis? How does energy efficiency play into this load shape and flexibility? So let's turn initially to, what is the total energy consumption at a data center comprised of? And you can see on the top left that you've got servers and storage, you've got network hardware, you've got power conversion and lighting, right? Which is sort of core to actually just running servers. But what's interesting, I think, or interesting for this industry is how much the cooling system takes at 37%. It is a very significant portion of overall demand. Now, if you look at the left bottom graphic, you can see the historical US average data center PUE, which stands for power usage efficiency and is really an index indicating how much more than the underlying hardware is used at the site, which is largely a reflection of climate control. And you can see over time it's fallen to around the 1.6 number. But we know that some sort of industry leading sites have achieved something close to one, probably at a very significant cost. But I think one of the opportunities available to the industry is engaging with these centers and ensuring that they're using at least the most efficient energy efficiency that they can, which might be, ground loop heat pumps. It could just be insulation, but certainly there is significant energy savings to be had. Now, in terms of what actually plays out, we've got some analysis by E3 showing the relative impacts of, if we go to liquid cooling, if the processor becomes more efficient, and if all of these things sort of happen over time. And so you can get from 100% today to something that looks very different depending on those assumptions. And these assumptions and these estimates are going to be really core to the overall forecast of energy consumption, but also peak demand in Australia. Terms of the load shape, this is one of the least well understood area of data center load forecasting. And we've included here an academic paper from 2010, which shows how sparse the data set is in the public domain here. And you can see that it has a commercial load curve that many of us will recognize, one that is seems to be quite sensitive to operating, but also temperature conditions. And I think that this is reflective of what we just saw there in terms of the impact of climate. And then we have some other load shapes on the right side, which are much flatter. And the bottom right actually is blown up between 3.5 and 5.5% of daily load to give a little bit of indication of some sensitivity or some non-industrial shape that has been estimated here. Personally, I think data centers are going to look more like the atoms on the left until they have significant changes to their temperature sensitivity and get closer to a PEU of one. Um, if you really want to go deep here, you have to get into data center load forecasting. They also have to forecast their loads and ensure they've got processing power sufficient to meet them. Because the worst possible thing that can happen if you're a data center is you're not there to deliver when somebody wants to buy whatever widget it is, or you're in real time. Sorry, if you're in virtual reality or you're gaming. I'm told that like a 1 millisecond delay in virtual reality can actually make you nauseous. And so, time matters for synchronous computing, and that's going to drive a great deal of activity. So, as I said, the difference between synchronous computing and asynchronous computing is one of the most important elements of data center load forecasting and energy efficiency and load shape. Because it drives, if you have to be in real time, you can only be so far away from the load. One, excuse me, 100 kilometers on a fiber optic network, I'm told, takes 1 millisecond. So, if you want to be there for real time or synchronous computing, then you need to be close to load, and that's one of the key drivers. And when we did analysis and research, mostly research, trying to find the ratio of processing that was real time versus asynchronous, we couldn't find anything. So we asked a generative AI what they thought the answer was, and we're displaying it here. But just be forewarned that we could not find any actual data or references, even when it was Perplexity, which prided itself on references, to back up this up. So just assume this is made up. But one day, and hopefully not too much in the future, we will get this sort of understanding. Because if you're high on the processing activity that has to be real time, then most of that growth in that sector will have to be situated close to load, and vice versa. All right, let's talk about siting and sizing. Now, I think increasingly people know what a hyperscale data center is. And interestingly, in the US, it's about 100 to 300 megawatts. And I've had that many discussions around people wanting to plan for 1 gigawatt connections. So I don't know if that's uber hyperscale or super hyperscale, but it seems to be bigger than the definition in the US. There's about 510 of these in the whole US. Then we've got the enterprise, which is located with the actual, whether it's healthcare or a financial institution, but is located there. Co-located, um, which it means it's just got a third party in there. And then the edge data centers, which I think are really interesting. These are data centers that are much smaller, 1 to 5 megawatts. They could fit on 11 kV or 22 kV feeder in any Australian suburb. And they're there because of people gaming or doing virtual reality in the suburbs, or Internet of Things, like for autonomous driving, and you just cannot afford that latency. And we expect to see these distributed quite widely, and they could be tucked into a very small footprint, as opposed to the hyperscale, which is more like a residential or a major uh, development that's going to be built out over 5 to 10 years. Now, where are these data centers distributed in the U.S.? Not just for crypto, like I showed you before. You can see most of the data centers are in northern to Virginia, and that's like saying that they are, in an Australian context, pretty much close to Canberra. There's a lot of mixing of IT centers in that area, which might explain why it's got so much installed there. But it's also very close to Washington D.C. In other places, we got Phoenix, Dallas, Atlanta. These are all relatively low cost areas, but not the lowest cost areas. You'd be, I think, up in the Dakotas. So it's a very interesting mix. And generally, the understanding is to situate a data center Land costs, electricity costs, telco speed, and proximity to users are the key drivers. And you have to look at that with the lens of what the ratio of synchronous to asynchronous computing is for a given industry, and then link that industry to growth. All right, let's then talk about what are the key levers given all of that and some interesting topics. So, customer classification. This is a very live issue in the US because these data centers are asking for a huge amount of connection capacity, and that request um, is increasingly being knocked back. Is there's just no more space, and so they're saying, "Oh well, can I get connected directly to behind the meter resources?" And we're not talking like some rooftop PV. We're talking like nuclear power stations, and that of course is raising people's hackles. And so the question for this industry is, are data centers unique, or are they just another industrial load? And based on other analysis we've done, I think that that will boil down to how flexible is the resource, and also just what is its actual load shape, and does it have a similar cost to serve? And so generally, I haven't really seen evidence for it being like different than an industrial load. The FERC, which is the U.S. regulator, like the AEMC, has also found that they're not necessarily different, and therefore need to not be offered discounted tariffs. In terms of connection policy, we've got a first come first served sort of queuing process, and that hasn't really worked out very well for us in connecting new renewables. Now these are, as big as the biggest, or increasingly as big as the biggest renewable projects, and we expect connection capacity, if it even exists, after we finish connecting heavy and medium duty transport and DC fast chargers. That it'll be very difficult to get these sites connected as well, and so I think we're gonna have another hard look at connection policy with respect to this growing load. In terms of the rates, again, our view is that there is a lot of flexibility, but because they haven't had to actually be flexible historically, there hasn't been a lot developed. But it's important that these rates are cost reflective. Otherwise, we will see quite rapidly developing cross subsidies if they're not addressed. In terms of energy efficiency and DR, 30% of the load right now is for thermal climate control. And to the extent that can be cost effectively addressed, then there will be good opportunities here. And again, as the full cost of connecting becomes more widely known, and the IT funders of this are strapped for cash, which has only become an issue recently, will we start to see some economically rational behavior interested in load flexibility? And then finally, in terms of how renewable, I mean, we've got renewable targets in Australia, so you have to be a certain level of renewable. Now, a lot of the blue chip IT companies want to be more renewable than that, faster. So we do expect a lot of renewable energy projects to be tied to these data centers, certainly for the tier one group. A lot of opportunity here, but certainly at the moment we're at the height of the hype cycle. So, in terms of key takeaways and recommendations, the growth is uncertain, but our fundamental analysis suggests we have legs for at least 10 years, uh, potentially longer, and it looks to be quite a wild ride. Growth will be uneven, focused on areas near to major population centers, fiber links, and low real estate and electricity costs. It's hard to get all four of those in the one place, and the new connections will vary in size. Very large connections near population centers like Sydney, Melbourne, etc., but also distributed into the suburbs for the right sizing to deliver to population centers away from the CBD. Um, the significant portion of the load seems to reflect underlying economic and demographic patterns, right? As soon as we get up and we start trading on the stock market, driving our cars, that kicks off more synchronous activity. Asynchronous stuff then tries to fill in the valley. Um, but overall, it's really the temperature that drives the shape at the moment. So key recommendations: determine the nature of utilities' likely share of that IT intensive industry load, and allocate appropriate levels of effort. How close are you to population and business centers? How good is your fiber connectivity, and how low are your land and electricity prices? How much spare capacity do you have in the distribution, medium voltage, and subtransmission networks, as well as transmission networks in areas of low land prices connected to the fiber backbone, and consider opportunities for strategic planning and connection policies. We maybe need to consider strategic zones like we do for renewable energy, um, because building some of the higher, the transmission and subtransmission lines just take a lot of time. I'd suggest being proactive about cost reflective rates and associated demand response programs. And best practice here does not exist. We're involved in some projects looking at this now. And then be proactive with the renewable energy solutions, as this customer segment, I think, is one of the leaders generally in zero carbon sort of outlooks. And it's one of the only kinds of load flexibility we've seen with one of the tier one players looking to manage their IT loads in data centers to better align with when we've got excess renewables. Great. Well, thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed that and learned something. And I look forward to the questions. And please don't forget to vote. All right. First question, please. Would the lowest PUEs correlate with higher water use? Ah, don't necessarily know. I mean, for me, heat pumps are a good way to reduce your energy consumption. Ground source heat pumps, if they're using water as the medium, could use more water. But sounds like you have a view that there's a relationship there. So, is the variability in load going to be more from utilization or outside temperature? Well, at the moment, and based on conversations I've had with utilities that have a lot of data centers at the moment, the data center loads are relatively flat, and the variability is more likely to be from air conditioning load than the actual utilization. I mean, if imagine if you were a planner and you had the ability to manage your load so that it was you could shape it however you wanted, or like 50% of it, right? You would have almost perfect utilization, and that's really what they're doing. They have their core stuff that's synchronous, and the rest of the time they're doing logistics, et cetera. And e-commerce is a good example of that. When you click the button to buy something, that better go through. But when you're sleeping and not clicking on buying stuff, the rest of the supply chain has to sort itself out, and that's the asynchronous processing. PoE is problematic in comparing two data centers. An IT inefficient center in Tasmania can get a better PU than an efficient one in Queensland. Has analysis been done on locating data centers in colder regions? Will the transmission costs be beneficial? I've not seen it. I mean, I think if you've got a natural cooling, then that's got to help. And but as the processes get more efficient and give off less heat, that helps as well. So I think we're going to have to find the best solution at a given point in time, and certain areas will have advantages, and it could be including the climate. Does California allow behind the meter CCGT plants, which a data center could use to help meet its power needs, or does SB 100 permit new behind the meter CC? This seems like a very California centric question. Um, so SB 100 certainly requires electricity to be 100% by 2030, 45. Um, and whether or not you can connect something behind the meter, I think is probably going to fall more in planning regulations. Um, and in California, I'd have to. I'm not aware. I'm not aware, but I haven't looked at it recently of any new CCGTs or open cycle gas turbines being proposed in California, and probably because they don't think they're going to get planning approval to actually do it. But you look in other markets, and I want to say I can't remember. It's in PGM, but somebody is proposing building a nuclear power station to serve this load. And you can see it if you're potentially using a gigawatt of power, your behind the meter resource looks very different. But I think about in Australia, the so when you're off grid, yeah, you have your own power system, and you can look in the West. Um, but oftentimes, they were connected to the main grid, whether it's a smelter or something else that's a large load, and there was concessionary deals, and you had demand response in place, etc. So they made it work once upon a time, but this was 30 years ago or more, since we've seen these kind of loads come on. How does China's it's DeepSeek model change these outlooks and recommendations? I don't know that they necessarily do. I'm a little bit wary of information coming from a source that's less, maybe less transparent and hasn't been studied yet. It's unclear whether there was how much state backing there was to source chips, how many chips were used, and so I'd like to get some more independent third party information about whether or not how much more efficient these large language models can be. And don't forget, this is really just one of the applications being large language models. It doesn't really impact on crypto or any of the other processes or any of the economic sectors other than that. The potential load increase seems massive. Given the generation build out in Australia is already behind schedule for simply replacing coal, do you have a view on where the generation will come from? Firmed RE or firmed renewable energy, or does this renew the uncomfortable discussion for new baseloads such as nuclear? So I think nuclear has been a great investment for some countries. Like when I was in France, the French really built a great fleet and ran the heck out of it. I think Canada has had some good luck with it. It is just such a big um, capability to establish. Um, Renewable energy, I mean, we're building 1 gigawatt scale stuff. I think I'm pretty sure the industry can deliver the projects. I'm not sure that we have enough capacity to for the transmission level constraints and whether or not you build a project next to these data centers. The other question is, what is the boom bust cycle here? And we're going to overbuild for sure. How long will that last, et cetera? But I still think over time that there is it needs coordination, it needs orchestration, um, but that this demand is pretty real to the extent it can be built, and the real counter forces are more likely to be people who are not able to connect, whether it's a new disadvantaged housing community or something else, and that will get the politics and pushing back to connect all of this stuff that wants to connect. The other thing is we definitely have some cross subsidies in the system, particularly around how projects feed up through the system that will need to be addressed, or there could be quite quickly cross subsidies that make air conditioning look like a walk in the park, or solar for that matter. I just got a few questions and appreciate your response. How load of data centers is weather sensitive in recent years? Look, we have not seen um, we have not seen data as of yet on actual load data center and their and its weather sensitivity. This is something that we're in the process of looking at, but I wish I had better answers for you, but it's not a lot of data in the public domain. What do we know about how much energy efficiency is being considered in a new data center building shell design? Is it front of mind already? So my relatively ignorant understanding is that we have certain data centers that are being built by tier one players, and those will probably have energy efficiency that is tier one because of their sustainability. And we have been on projects for tier one tech players, and there was a lot of work done on energy efficiency and flexibility with respect to renewables. I think the second tier stuff where we've got prospective data center hosting like co-location, et cetera, I suspect that's more of a dash for real estate, right? Just as we tried to put our windmills in the best wind locations, I think developers are trying to put data centers in the best connection areas, knowing that this demand is going to show up. And so, once you get your connection into the grid and it locks it up, guess what? You've got a monopoly for a little while. We've got the same problem with DC fast chargers and medium and heavy duty charging infrastructure. Like once that's sucked up and whatever excess capacity there is, the industry is not built for turning on a dime. I know I used to work at Osgrid, and it's going to take time, and there will be, I think, a fair bit of pain in the 5 to 10 years as this all gets worked out. Can data centers be located away from population centers? Certainly, and I think we've seen in some of those graphics that they can and they are. Um, but it really is only to serve excess non-synchronous computing, right? Because by definition, you're too far away for the really fast synchronous computing requirements. And in terms of what that requires to locate there, I mean, you have to study sort of what the concessions have been, because once you move away from being, 1 millisecond away from people, then access to fiber and others, fast enough connections and land and the electricity prices become the primary driver, like any load with flexibility. Do data centers have the ability to fail over to another data center? Look, that's a really interesting question. And in the work that we've done, we have seen. I mean, IT is known for resiliency, for failover, for being able to, the utility and the electricity utility has sort of N-2 or N-3 in some major CBDs. But IT has that, and not only in terms of N-1 or N-2, but if the whole thing gets blown away, then it sort of gets backed up in the next hour, sort of thing. So we do know that folks package up their work and ship it to whatever area's got spare capacity. Again, that's for the asynchronous computing. For the synchronous computing, um, I would imagine that there are for contingency and business continuity purposes that if a whole data center goes down, that it's going to get rerouted. Are you going to experience an interruption in service? I'm pretty sure you will, because if you're a 1 gigawatt size server farm, you can't just easily recover from that. And it does beg the question of how much spare capacity is sitting around for situations like that. Because if you don't have a perfect one for one capacity that's ready to ramp up, um, you're not going to get the same sort of N minus experience as you do if you actually have like a hot transformer and a sub, and it's never loaded over 50%, and it can take the full load of the other transformer. During high traffic periods or seasonal spikes, how do data centers prioritize workloads? I don't. Well, first of all, I don't know for sure. The work that we're doing, looking at demand response for a particular data center operator is early days. Um, but I do not think electricity efficiency is even really on their radar. It really is around service quality, um, and getting the most out of their servers in the meanwhile. But again, most pricing in the U.S. is flat, even for pretty large utilities, and there has not been significant price signals to encourage anyone to worry too much about load shape. Well, okay. So traditionally, industrial and customer connections are funded through long-term network tariffs, 20 years plus. Is this model at risk? As it seems like DC's business models seem more short-term. I mean, I think that's a really important question to consider because, I mean, people are making investments in property development and connections and concrete that are at least 20 years uh, in terms of I would expect their economic lifetime. Yes, you got to rip those servers out probably every 3 to 4 years and put in new ones. But I think the business model is not necessarily shorter lived. It's probably um, more sustained and sustaining than, say, mining. But yeah, sure, crypto demand for that could fold up overnight if all of a sudden there was a crash in prices. Whether or not you get a 20-year or a 10-year PPA from a data center, I'd imagine you could do. I mean, this is the difference, right, between getting your connection capacity and having that. Basically, it's like land rights. But that doesn't mean that somebody's going to start buying a contract for delivery of energy, right? Because that depends on the actual build out of that site over time. And those of us in the planning and forecasting industry know spot loads are notoriously difficult to forecast, because what the developers think is going to happen almost always turns out not to be true. And so, one of the key aspects of our regulatory regime is to make sure that third parties don't carry that risk, and that any connection that they buy, they pay for. And if they're not using it, it might even be a take or pay situation. So again, I think there's a lot of policy and regulatory questions that really need to be thought through. And if they're not in advance, they will be as the hairs on this all come to light. Should policymakers consider optimizing location of data centers or perhaps reserving grid capacity for sectors that need to electrify road freight? There's a hyper concentration of data center projects, especially in Western Sydney, which competes with warehouses. Yeah, I mean, I think look, it's a political question. Gas reserves, any of these sorts of things. I think that will become a political issue, and it will be for the politicians to sort out. But I'm pretty sure what you're describing here about Western Sydney is going to come to every major metropolitan area in Australia in the next 5 years. An article by Bloomberg in December last year quoted a fuel cell supplier who said that while data centers have had a relatively flat load in the past, AI data centers are showing a sawtooth demand profile. Wow. Well, I've not heard that, nor, I don't know if that's the training part of it or if that's the demand part of it. Again, I think the main thing is that the industry start to analyze and engage with this sector very quickly. Like this is going to be probably your number one growth area. And if you don't understand your number one growth area, it's going to create all kinds of problems. And it needs to be thought through on a holistic, soup to nuts basis so that connection policy, rates policy, demand management, behind the meter solutions, all of this is in a good place when these customers start coming knocking. I know they're already there, but if you believe everything that you read and what you're told, that the systems it's going to make the AMO hydrogen export superpower scenario look tame. What will the uptake and impact of AI-based data center loads in Australia What will the uptake and impact of AI-based data center loads in Australia be, considering most AI tech giants are based in the US? Well, so I think how much of the servers and loads are related to designing and engineering this stuff, and I can't, I don't know that I've seen evidence that that's a significant part of it. It's really in the users. And so I would expect Australia, at the very least, to get a pro rata share for an economy its size. And then whether or not it is well suited to uh, provide data center capacity for other countries that it's closer to than the US, that remains to be seen. And again, I think most peak demand in this industry is synchronous computing, and then the rest of it just fills in the valleys. Whoop, I missed that one. How do data centers manage their electricity consumption during peak periods, especially with the grid understood? Again, I don't think that they necessarily do, at least in the US, because the pricing signals are not really there. I think they generally have a strategy of making sure that they've got the capacity to use the electricity, and then they focus on their number one business, which is providing data center services. So I think as they come up against an industry that's not used to operating at maybe at the speed of IT, um, and they're faced with difficult choices of not having a site or being more flexible or being more energy efficient, um, then I think they will start to be conversations. Do these sites have backup generators? If so, could they be used for demand side participation in certain types? I think that's a really good question, and I wonder how much of their redundancy is provided by redundant assets in other places, and how much is provided by on-site backups. Again, the value of what they're doing, if you're processing payments, is so much higher than the value of the electricity, that I would be very surprised if these don't have on-site backup generators. And in work that we've done in microgrids, et cetera, you need that backup to meet whatever your backup requirement is. But 99% of the time, you'll have surplus backup and you could be using those assets more efficiently and more commercially productive. So I'll take a couple more questions. I think we'll close this off at 1/4 past. Really appreciate all these questions. A lot of interest. Very exciting area. How would variability in these large data centers affect voltages and frequencies in the grid, and how would distribution companies manage these, especially when data centers trip completely off? So okay, This is actually something that we heard recently that I hadn't been really thinking of. If you've got a 1 gigawatt load and it goes offline, that becomes your single greatest contingency. Although we do have interconnectors that are bigger than that now. Um, but I think that's something we need to consider and to deal with, which is as these loads get really large and they trip off, this is um, a new risk factor for the system planners to cater to, and it's going to have an impact on our ancillary services, among other things. In terms of voltage and frequency on the grid, these are all, for the most part, they are switch mode power supplies. You know, basically uh, inverter based, and will have the same sort of issues. And I'm not a power engineer, so I'll leave it at that. Last one, if there's one. If not, it's been great having all of these questions. We appreciate you making the time, and we will hopefully look forward to seeing you at our next webinar on hard to abate sectors. Thank you very much for joining us.